Ladies and gentlemen, it's a pleasure for me to stand here before you this evening again for the sixth time, offering you the sixth and final lecture in this series of Cátedra lectures on Jheronimus Bosch and Pieter Bruegel and the artistic inventions and adventures that they engaged in the early 16th century. Today, I will finish the series by coming back to the Garden of Earthly Lights and will offer you an interpretation, especially in the second half of my presentation, of the Garden of Earthly Lights as a form of pictorial conversation. Among the surprising results of the technical studies of the Garden of Earthly Delights, which were conducted at the occasion of the 5th Centennial Jheronimus Bosch exhibition in the Prado Museum this summer. Among these surprising results is the revelation of some major changes in the final paint stage of the painting compared to earlier preparatory design stages. These changes, which have been made visible with infrared reflectographic imaging, regard, among others, the representation of the face of the creator in the left wing of the triptych. The infrared reflectography, which you see here, of his face has revealed a shift in the direction of the face. I'm asking your attention for the face of the creator. In an early design phase, it looked down on the sitting figure of Adam. But in the final execution, it looks straight at the viewer of the painting. This was not only a formal change, but also a change of concept. Instead of the bearded face of God the Father that the Creator originally was supposed to have, in accordance with the facial type of the Creator on the exterior of the triptych, Bosch or his advisors decided to give him the appearance of Christ. Here you see God the Father as he was represented on the exterior of the painting. And this representation of Christ followed rather meticulously a legendary description of Jesus' countenance that in the Middle Ages was thought to be a faithful account of an eyewitness, the so-called Lentulus letter, a Roman soldier who supposedly had seen Christ and had given a description of his face. This shift was rather radical. The shift away from a focus on Adam and instead an emphatic gaze at the viewer meant a major breakdown, of course, of the internal narrative, the narrative cohesion in terms of what the general impression of the composition of the creation scene is, namely a rendering of the so-called institution of marriage, a representation of God bringing Eve after creating her from Adam's rib to Adam as his spouse, as you see here traditionally represented in an image on the right by Jean Fouquet. So what is the reason for this change? Why destroy the internal narrative? Why destroy the traditional iconography and make the creator, Christ, the central figure of the narrative? And why, moreover, create this emphatic appeal to the viewer to respond to Christ's gaze and thus become part of the story? A good start to find an answer to this question is to realize that Adam, who is represented sitting on the ground and looking at his creator with wide open eyes, sees Christ, or rather his creator in the bodily form of Christ. The underdrawing, by the way, clearly shows that in the original design, Adam returned the gaze of God. He was looking at God. In the final painted version, the direction of Adam's gaze remained the same. He's not looking at Eve as sometimes has been stated. How is it possible that Adam sees Christ? One needs to raise the question. How is it possible that Adam sees Christ and not God the Father while he is in the Garden of Eden? long before Jesus was born. Medieval theologians who wrestled with the concept of the Trinity, that is, God the Father, Christ the Son, and the Holy Ghost, and the unity, the triunion of these divine personae, they maintained that Christ, as part of the Trinity, was always with God from the very beginning of time, and thus could be seen, in a way, by Adam in the Garden of Eden. From this traditional theological Trinitarian point of view, so to speak, it really didn't matter whether God the Creator was represented in the shape of God the Father or the Son. But this theological explanation is not very satisfactory, of course, in view of the fact that Bosch decidedly changed the shape of the Creator from that of God the Father into that of the Son. A better explanation is the fact that traditionally Adam was thought to have received a dream from God, a dream vision, while God created Eve from his rib. A dream vision in which Adam foresaw the future salvation of mankind through Christ the Son on the cross. And we have seen in the first lecture in this series that in Bosch's painting, Adam's stretched legs and crossed feet, which you see clearly here, that these stretched legs and crossed feet, precisely where they touch the feet of the Creator, prefigure Jesus' crucifixion. Adam, in other words, literally prefigures with his own body and foresees this salvific event while he is dreaming, and thus in his dream sees Christ standing in front of him. He sees Christ with his spiritual eye. And to indicate the portentous nature of this seeing, Bosch has represented Adam with his eyes wide open, of course. Adam sees Christ not in an act of corporeal vision with his bodily eyes, but in his dream, seeing with his inner eyes the vision that God sends him. The consequence of the fact that the Creator has turned his head and looks at us viewers of the painting, looks us directly in the eye, is that we too, of course, return his gaze and see the future Savior standing right in front of us. This strangely but finely orchestrated pictorial play with faces and gazes thus aims at creating a certain type of viewership. We are drawn into this enigmatic picture Bosch has created for us, which we now understand to represent a dream world. And we are being asked to see this world through the eyes of Adam. That is, as a world in which our relationship, us as viewers, our relationship with God, the Creator, is central. How should this relationship then be defined? This is where the other side of the creation scene, with Eve, where Eve comes into play, is revealing. As we have seen, the marriage connotation of the scene does not only relate to the marriage of Adam and Eve, which is a traditional theme in medieval creation iconography, but also relates to the figure of Christ, the new Adam, and the new Eve, that is the church, who, personified as the bride of the crucified bridegroom, emerges from Jesus' side wound on the cross, like once Eve emerged from Adam's rib. And you see this complicated sentence in a way represented on the left, where you see a clear resonance between the creation of Eve in the upper part from Adam's rib, and then in the lower scene on your left, you see Christ in a way pulling Eve out of, that is the new Eve, the church, out of Christ's own body hanging on the cross. This is the parallelism that you clearly see represented in that image. That is to say, the relationship between Adam and Eve and Christ the Creator in the Garden of Earthly Lights is also defined in terms of a bridal love or a bridal union between not only Adam and Eve, but also between the Creator and Adam and Eve, between the Creator and mankind. That is the content of Adam's dream vision, to which we, viewers and descendants, all of us, of Adam and Eve, are also invited. Thus, it must be noticed as an important aspect of Bosch's creation scene that there is a second set of faces, of phantasmagoric physiognomies this time, that involve the viewer in the creation scene. And I'm referring to what you see here and what you see here. Usually, when we're looking at a fountain, usually a fons vitae, a fountain of life, is depicted in the immediate vicinity of the creator in creation scenes, as you see here in two examples of the period. In Bosch's painting, the fountain assumes, however, an anthropomorphic shape, with the lower part, the belly, so to speak, from which vegetative arms are branching out, and a head that hides a grimly smile in the complex web of its tracery. The empty eyes, so different from Christ's gaze, the empty eyes of this phantasmagoric phantom, and you're never sure whether you are right in seeing a face or not. So this is a phantom that is staring at the viewer, echoing Christ's gaze, but whereas the latter echoes Christ's gaze, but whereas the latter offers a solid anchor in the painting, Christ's gaze offers a solid anchor for the response of our gaze, the fountain's face eludes this certainty. We may be imagining, just dreaming, if you will, that we see a face. The black owl, perched in the hollow opening of the belly, qualifies the nature of our gaze more clearly. It is not different. Our gaze is not different from that of the birds that have landed in, on, or near the fountain, on its branches. It is the gaze of curiosity that is drawn towards the enigmatic fountain phantom. Contemporary images explicate this constellation as a symbolic representation of the devil luring humans into the web of its temptations, here represented by a bird catcher and a coil owl that attracts other birds. So we're talking about an alternative fons vitae that is actually a fountain of death, that towers high above and behind the figure of Christ, as if to vie with the Creator. And he too has an phantasmagoric companion, the strange rock face, the features of which are drawn into the soil of the Garden of Eden by a pack of reptilian vermin. It is these reptiles that draw literally the contours and the shape of this face. I've pointed out before in the first lecture that this skull-like face with a fruit-bearing tree that is placed on its barren cranium echoes the widespread lore in the Middle Ages that Adam's skull was buried underneath the place where later the cross made from the wood of the tree of life was erected. The black serpent that coils around the trunk bespeaks, of course, not of life, but of death. And I ask your attention for this detail. The multiple legs of this large bug that forms the eye of this rock face create the impression of a downcast eyelashes, and thus confirm the notion that we are looking at a dead or sleeping or blind creature that is drawn into the soil. But here too, we're talking about an enigmatic phantom. We are not entirely sure if we really, well, we may see a face, but if it is really there. Now there is a striking resemblance and at the same time contrast in all of this with the constellation of the creation scene in the foreground. In the foreground we see the face of Christ in all clarity addressing us with his gaze. Behind him we see or imagine to see the phantasmagorical physiognomy of a grimly sneer hiding in the tracery of a devious appearance of a fountain of life. In the foreground, we see Adam having a dream vision of his creator in the shape of his future savior, the new Adam. Behind them, we see the slumbering skull of old Adam, so to speak, who is buried in the soil of the Garden of Eden, which is pervaded and perverted by the same reptiles that have caused, the same vermin that has caused the fall of Adam. These downcast eyelashes of this bug-shaped eye contrast, of course, with the wide-open eye of Adam in the foreground, and seem to be an emblematic token of the blindness of this face to the hidden figure, the hidden Gestalt, as the Germans would say, of the devil, whom he literally faces in the fountain of life, the fountain of death, but he doesn't see. See and not seeing, seeing through, blind-eyed, open eyes, that is the discourse that is offered to us. This antithetical and at the same time mirror-like constellation makes us realize that Bosch's imagery in the left panel of the Garden of Earthly Delights is essentially of a double nature, double image. It offers true images, especially that of Christ, true imagery exemplified in the face of Christ, and it offers also false, deceiving imagery, exemplified by the facial grin in the fountain behind Christ. It shows, moreover, two ways of looking at these images. The perceptive gaze of insight and foresight, which sees through outward appearances of Adam in the foreground, and the stare of wonder, captivated by the shine of marvels, and blind to the manipulation of evil, like the birds that are attracted by the owl hiding in the belly of the fountain. All of this is staged as phantom-like dream imagery, which conflates the geography of the Garden of Eden with the geography of the mind. This double nature of this dream imagery is offered to us as an introduction to the central panel and what lies beyond it, namely the imagery on the right panel, of course. Since the paradisiacal geography of the scenery in the central panel clearly continues that of the left, we are facing a continuation of this double dream imagery. And thus we are offered two ways of looking at this imagery. In the vein of the perceptive gaze of Adam as he was originally created by God, and in the vein of the slumbering stare of the post-lapsarian Adam. I use the words post-lapsarian, post-lapsus, fall, after the fall, in order to convey the traditional notion of the fall of Adam and Eve as a fall of the eye of curiosity, which was very influential in the times of Jheronimus Bosch, especially among adherents of the Devotia Moderna, this spiritual movement that was very important also in the hometown of Jheronimus Bosch, Den Bosch. We have the option, therefore, to marvel at the wondrous curiosities as such that the central panel has to offer, but also to develop a more inquisitive gaze, which is not bound by the spell of outward appearances and first impressions. It is important to realize and to emphasize that this is not a question of either or, seeing it this way or that way. There is no way to avoid and no way to enjoy with our eyes of curiosity these very marvels Bosch has created for us, of course. We love what we see. We can only reach a level of perceptive vision, however, when we also look through what we have encountered first with our eye of curiosity. This regards, in other words, a perceptive process, not two alternative states of vision. And this process, by the way, is not necessarily linear, but can be circular or elliptical or even hovering between two different perceptive modes, and thus can leave us in a state of doubt and confusion and disagreement and conversation about what we see, and disagreements about the different options, and discussions and conversations when we hear alternative interpretations of what we see or think we see. I will address this important aspect of conversation in a moment. But first, we may look, for example, take a few motifs at the beautiful fountain, large fountain in the center of the Garden of Earthly Delights proper. I'm just giving you one or two examples of what it is to look at these images from two different perspectives. We see, of course, that this fountain in the center echoes the general shape of the fountain of life in the left panel. So there are two fountains that in general shape resemble each other. This may make us wonder whether, despite the elegant forms and costly crystal-like materials this central fountain on the right appears to be made of, also harbors some dark secret. And indeed, it is difficult to see in reality because it concerns a tiny detail in the background of the painting, which you can only see if you are very close to the painting. Indeed, here too, this belly, this hollow belly of the fountain has a figure. It shows an erotic activity that can hardly be called innocent, especially from this lapsarian post-fall point of view, because a naked man is reaching into the crotch of a naked woman, while she points to the naked butt of another companion. And once we perceive this detail, of course, once we have perceived it, we may wonder what the visual resonance with the dark owl in the center of the fountain of life may tell us. But then the fountain is also surrounded by 4 towers and 4 rivers. 4 towers and 4 rivers, which resonate clearly with contemporary representations of earthly paradise. This is stock and trade motif. You see the fountain of life, and you see with some difficulty 4 rivers and towers marking this 4-partite division of the Garden of Eden in this, among many other examples. So this counteracts this association with a paradise, counteracts, of course, a suggestion of sin or evil. Well, it is all play and joyful frolicking that we see, at least around the central fountain in Bosch's case. On the other hand, and so we're talking about on this hand, on that hand, we can see it this way and that way. On the other hand, we may notice that these towers are not exclusively paradisiacal. There are thorns sticking out and stuck into their festive architecture. And there is this strange wild energy underlying the sprouting forms, especially in that tower. This wild energy underlying the sprouting forms that burst from within these constructions. It comes from within, which has not only positive connotations as kind of creative energy, because other details talk about a different kind of energy, namely these kind of forms that clearly resemble, as I pointed out also in the first lecture, some of the warfare machines in engravings such as this follower from Bosch. So are we looking at a peaceful, a blissful paradise, or are we looking at something that disguises, hides before our eyes, in front of our eyes actually, something more dark, something more violent? How can we disentangle ourselves from these apparent contradictions which we encounter in basically all the scenes in the central panel. Isn't that possible to take a step back and get a clear view of the Garden of Earthly Delights? That many interpreters, including myself, try to give the readers and viewers of the painting. Can we really take a step back, kind of summarize what we see? It is important to realize that in all likelihood, this triptych was never made for such a thing as getting a clear view, taking a step back, and that the noise of contradictory voices of one interpretation versus the other that vie in my head and in your head for consent cannot be silenced. We need to go back to the realization that we are dealing here with a world of true and false dream images that are not neatly separated from each other, but are inextricably interwoven with each other. At least this is how they appear to us in the state that we are in when we are looking at the painting. While we have no immediate source that tells us anything about the historical reception of the triptych, we can, strangely enough, say indeed something more precise about this state of viewership. We cannot say what this state of viewership leads to, what kind of interpretation it will lead to, but we can say something about our state of viewership, if we may call it that way, the state of viewership that the painting puts us in. This is possible when we take a look at contemporary dream narratives and contemporary dream discourse, which I will only summarize very briefly now. Several authors have noted, and I've alluded to this before as well, a certain resemblance between the imagery of the Roman de la Rose, the Romance of the Rose, and the Garden of Earthly Lights. The Romance of the Rose, in essence, is a dream tale, which explores the adventures of Amant, the lover, in his efforts to conquer his beloved and then to pluck the rose. There are also certain details in the right panel of Bosch's triptych, such as the frozen river or the monstrous bird-like figure of Lucifer that swallows human souls and defecate them into the pit of hell, that correlate directly with late medieval dream narratives, such as the Vision of Tandale. Several art historians have pointed that out. As I've summarized in the beginning of my lecture today, how central the idea of the dream is to the imagery of the left panel, and how this could guide us in our approach to the central panel, we should realize the importance of these dream narratives. But there is even another reason, and visually perhaps the most appealing one, why the imagery in the central panel should be taken as dream imagery, which puts us viewers in a state of dreaming too. That is the state of viewership that I mean. When we look at the painting, we are, if you will, automatically, without any possible resistance, taking into the dream world, incorporated in it, and thus this makes us dreamers too. All interpretations of Jheronimus Bosch's Garden of Earthly Lights are Traumdeutung, as the Freud would have called it. It has never been noticed in the literature about Bosch that there is a striking correspondence between this imagery and a large body of texts offering descriptions of conversations about love, many of which are situated in a dreamt garden setting, just like the Roman de la Rose. These texts are called, with a German term, Minnerreden, and I will use the term several times. Minnerreden means conversations about love. Minne means love, and reden means speak, conversation. Minnerreden, conversation about love. And these texts regard more specifically the late medieval conventions of courtly love, and all of this discussed and described in dreamt garden settings. So typical for the narrative structure of these written conversations is the multi-layered dream even, of the dream within the dream. And that is, this narrative structure is as follows. After the protagonist falls asleep, he or she, often he, starts dreaming that he embarks upon a journey through the countryside. Taking a rest in this walk, he falls asleep again and receives a dream in which he is brought to a beautiful garden where the secrets of love, more in particular the rules of courtly love, are being revealed to him, though in a veiled manner, which demands interpretation and explanation, also after the dreamer has woken up. And then the question is, does the dreamer wake up in the second dream or also in the first dream? That is very often left ambivalent. And therefore the structure of these dream narratives is designed to entangle the audience in that dream world. One doesn't know, you as a reader don't know if you, the dreamer, or if the dreamer has woken up from the second dream or also from the first. So that dreaming and the reflection on the state of dreaming go hand in hand and are actually merged. One gains some level of clarity, if that's the right term, about the dream within the state of dreaming, therefore, but never full clarity about the dream outside the state of dreaming, because we do not know if or when we are in the state of dreaming. This sentence may confuse you, and actually it should. Because that is specific for this ambivalent state of dreaming. Am I not dreaming? Do I see through or not? This seems to be very relevant for anyone, I think, interpreting the Garden of Earthly Delights. Because the painting in the left panel offers an introductory reflection on Adam's dream state, or dream states, and by implication of man's dreaming state in general. But in the central panel, without any further halt or guidance, ensnares the viewer in a very dream world of erotic activities, which in many respects relate to the codes of courtly love and courtly behavior, but very often in an inverse way. That is to say, can we test this idea? How do these scenes and figures precisely relate to the codes of courtly love and honor? And the best way for me to address this question is to take a look at another art form, large-scale tapestries, that are fully embedded in the late medieval discourse of courtly love, and that very much resonate with these minnaret and with these love conversations. These tapestries show some of the same visual narrative strategies, interestingly enough, that are also employed in the Garden of Earthly Delights. So I'm giving you now one major example of comparison between one very interesting tapestry and the Garden of Earthly Delights. This example regards an impressive tapestry in the German National Museum in Nuremberg, which shows courtiers engaged in several forms of playful entertainment, who are situated in a garden-like landscape setting set against a background of medieval castles. The activities that this courtly company is engaged in comprises different forms of verbal conversation and several games as well. 6 of them have been identified with a good degree of certainty. I'm going to pick up one particular game. And that game, I'm going back to you, that game is to be seen here in the upper left corner. It's one of the 6 here. And this is the detail. And I ask your attention for, and your detailed attention for. The game is called La main chaude, in French, literally the warm hand. The game entails the idea that a blindfolded person is leaning forward and has to guess who tapped him or her on the butt. And this is this blindfolded person. The representation of this simple game in this tapestry is actually more complex and more subtle than art historians have recognized. A man, I'm going to describe it precisely to you. a man with playful bells decorating his short jacket has put his head in the lap of a woman, the queen of the game, it seems, judging by her feathered chaplet, her feathered crown. This woman, who with her left hand presses a cap over the man's head in order to make sure that he cannot see who approaches him from behind. Now, a second woman gives her a hand, and I'm talking about this woman in green, while the two others are engaged in a heated conversation. And I mean this woman and this woman, she is handing her a help, giving her a hand, literally, also pressing the cap on to the head face of the man. And these two are in conversation with each other, but this woman as well. So there's a conversation going on and hands interacting with the man who leans over into her lap. A third woman, standing behind the other two, participates in this conversation. And I mean, this is this woman in green. Then a fourth woman is kneeling behind the blinded courtier, and he's actually performing the la main chaude. Here, this woman. She does so, and look carefully, with her left hand, while her right hand crosses over to grasp the left foot of the kneeling man. A detail that seems to make no sense, since it is not part of the game. This woman herself is even tapped on the butt by another man who kneels behind her. And these two, the kneeling woman and the man, are accompanied by another man and a woman who are bodily closely connected to the kneeling couple through further gestures of amicable touching. All the while, again, being in conversation with each other. It is important to pay attention to the way all men and women are interconnected through this play of hands, precisely because they go way beyond the simple illustration of the game of la main chaude. What these details tell us is that these male and female courtiers are engaged in a double or triple version of the game, magnifying its erotic connotations to a level of playful communal promiscuity, if you will. Most striking, however, is the fact that all of them are at the same time engaged in conversations, as if they are not busy with doing the game. Are these conversations not part of the game? What a strange combination. But it makes a lot of sense, strangely enough, in the light of recently published research of late medieval concept of conversation. This research is published by German scholars who are interested in these tapestries and in these minareten, these love conversations. Conversation, conversatio, especially when it concerns the theme of courtly love and when it's developed during casual meetings of male and female courtiers, entailed not only verbal communication, but also social interaction through action, through gestures, through play and games, playing games. Conversatio actually meant even more the latter than the first. Only in the course of the 17th century, conversatio started to have this specifically verbal connotation. During these conversations, the topic of love could be discussed in all its facets, focusing on the conventional rules of honorable behavior in these matters, which were already, or had already been codified in the 12th century by Andreas Capellano's De Arte Honesti Amandi, and in English, On the Art of Honorable Love. That was a very, very well-known piece of, if you will, theoretical writing on the rules of love that was very, very well-known, copied often also in other writings. So while the literary descriptions of such conversations in minareten abound in discussions and exhortations of these conventions, the more poetic and imaginative romances, such as the Romance of the Rose of the period, also describe the entire palette of possible violations of these codes of courtly love, honor. violations and divergence from the courtly, honorable courtoisie. The Nuremberg Games Tapestry thus offers a perfect illustration of a verbal and playful enacted form of conversatio, of conversation, which regards the ideals of courtly love, in particular about courtship, conventionally directed at a single person, but here, in this elaborate scene, projected against the realities, that is, the ideals of courtly love are projected against the realities and entanglements of multiple amorous affairs in the ambience of daily courtly love. So what you see is not only the heralding of a particular courtly play and courtly focus, the focus on one lover, but actually the opposite. You see all these courtiers engaged in all too bodily conversation with each other. Recent research of other tapestries and wall decorations with themes related to courtly love has furthermore shown that these conversations did not only take place, and this is key, in visual representations, but also in front of them, in front of the visual representation of these themes. That is, by the beholders of these images. Visual images, as well as these textual minderheden, it has been argued convincingly, served as incentives for such conversations by the audience. Often even more so than strictly illustrating these codes of love in the representations. They are staging verbal conversations and playful entertainment among courtly men and women, accompanied by banderoles. I'll give you a few examples how these tapestries look like. These inscriptions relate to fundamental themes of faithfulness, expressions of loyalty, of love, etc., and belong to the standard repertoire of topics explored and discussed in these contemporary written minderheden love conversations, without being direct citations of these texts, by the way. There are clear indications that these images with banderoles meant to initiate conversations about the same topics among the people standing in front of these tapestries, and to serve, if you will, as visual anchors for these extra pictorial conversations, our conversations. The same has been suggested for tapestries and other art objects showing no particular textual support, only courtiers being in conversation with each other as such. In quite a few cases, these conversations are portraying as occurring among or with so-called wild people, humans wearing no other clothes than their hairy fleece, who we imagine and they imagine to live in forests, and who personify man's natural, uncontrolled sexual impulses. These wild men can also be cultivated courtiers masquerading as wild people themselves, as you in a way see here in this example. Other tapestries show courtiers holding wild animals on a leash, or riding on wild animals that sometimes are quite similar, interestingly enough, to the wild animals that ride in the center of the carnival lights. Just look at these wild animals and look at these wild animals and wild courtiers riding on these animals. All these wild humans and animals clearly refer to the taming of man's wild nature. Now, the objective of these images is not, as sometimes has been suggested in the past, to portray the other, the wild uncultivated person, and then by way of contrast and contrarian behavior, propagate courtly behavior. But the objective and purpose of these images is to address the wild barbarian, forgive me, in you, in me, in us. The wild barbarian in ourselves, standing in front of these images. And to instigate a conversation and reflection of us beholders of these images about the other in us. This imagery, in other words, serves the dynamics of a conversatio, of a conversation that stretches way beyond the picture plane or tapestry realm and reaches into the very space of the beholder. There are many parallels between these tapestries with love themes and figures, late medieval iconography of love gardens, and the Garden of Earthly Delights. Several art historians have already noticed and commented on these correspondences, although they did not mention sufficiently these tapestries. What has not been discussed with regard to Bosch's triptych, despite the fact, and now I'm coming to a, for myself, kind of astonishing insight, if you will. What has not been discussed so far in the literature on Bosch's triptych, despite the fact that this is a really dominant feature of the central panel, especially in the foreground, is the occurrence of all kinds of conversations, verbal, at least, among men and women. And you can go through with your eyes all kinds of scenes of conversation with each other. We cannot hear what they say. This may be the reason why no one has ever addressed this. We cannot hear what they say. But judging by the way they nod their heads or look each other into the eyes, emphasize a point they are making with hand gestures, and prick up their ears when someone confident says something confidential and whispers that in their ear, that many women and men are actually in conversation with each other, even if you would go and see the painting far into the background. These activities are perhaps even more widespread, these conversations, these verbal conversations, are perhaps even more widespread than the erotic activities that simultaneously these figures, these people are engaged in, which suggests that the topics of these conversations are these activities, are these erotic activities, or more in general, relate to different aspects of human love, and more in particular, courtly love. Now, that the focus of these inaudible conversations indeed regards courtly love may not seem immediately obvious here, given the fact that none of the erotic activities can be said to comply with the codes and conventions of an honorable ars amandi, art of love. But let me just recall that the triptych very likely was commissioned by one of the counts of Nassau, probably Engelbrecht of Nassau for his nephew Hendrik III of Nassau, high nobles at the Burgundian court, and that quite a few scenes directly relate to contemporary representations of processions, games, and other activities that exclusively happened at or were connected to the life of the court, the life of the nobility at the Burgundian court. And I can only summarize and only give very, very few examples. Namely, the Morris dance that was performed, illustrated here, and echoed in this tapestry, and that seems to be echoed in the way these men swirl around the pond with naked women. This Morris dance was performed specifically at court festivities. And I'd like to also point to these lined up cavaliers who resemble processions of noble horsemen. Just not look at this thing for a second, but look at the way these horse riders are lined up neatly in the form of procession, which is so typical for the joyful entries into the cities and towns of Flanders at the time, in which these knights showed their banners and paraphernalia of knightlyhood. And if you look carefully in the way they carry branches and objects in their hands, it is as if they are carrying these paraphernalia of their knighthood in their hands. The acrobats, gems, pearls, and other precious stones that stand out in the artful architecture in the background, and now I'm referring to this image, in the background recall the theatrical performances, but also the fancy objects that were shown during the so-called entremets and during courtly banquets. And it is as if we are reminded of these strange kind of beautiful objects with all these beautiful gems and pearls and jewels when we look at these strange towers. Of course, they don't resemble this what you see in the center, but for people used to these altar mess and to the acrobats and performances that you actually see resonated by all the kinds of acrobats that jumble upon these towers, that for these courtiers would have been something to recognize. So viewers and viewership that I'm talking about is something that has to be imagined to take place very specifically at and for the Burgundian court among a small group of nobles. Not us people living in the 21st century. And then, of course, if that's an argument, there are the refined, alligated figures of men and women themselves. Naked as they are, they show the fashion, even in their postures, the fashion of these elongated figures of refined courtiers that we see in contemporary images of these noble people. Even when they are hairy, like this woman and other figures, and clearly resonate with these hairy, wild men in these tapestries. Now, we, noble men and women at this court, we who are the primary intended audience of the triptych, therefore see ourselves mirrored in the painting, and vice versa. The conversations that are going on in the painting reflect our own, and serve as incentives for our own. These are, given the ambience of Count Henry III's palace in Brussels, in which we find ourselves when looking at the painting, courtly discussions, courtly conversations per definition. And thus, in matters of amorous thought and behavior, naturally regards the conventions of courtly love, not just love in general. But we have seen that conversation in this period not only meant exchanging words, chatting, talking, discussing, whispering perhaps, but also playing games and communicating through postures, gestures, and other forms of body language, which you so clearly see happening, for example, among these men swirling around. It can be hardly coincidence, therefore. I think that it is precisely these activities that one sees depicted throughout the central panel of the Garden of Earthly Lights, in addition to several forms of verbal conversation. What we see, in other words, is precisely conversatio, conversation, in this late medieval sense of bodily conversatie and verbal conversation. That is to say, all activities in the central garden, from the verbal and bodily activities in the foreground to the acrobatic and theatrical forms of play in the background, can be subsumed under the late medieval concept of conversatio. It is in this sense that the three men who are ensnared in the prickly leaves of a huge bulbous plant, which we saw in the first lecture, or the entanglement of legs, feet, and hands in the group of naked men and women in the foreground, which we also discussed here, or the erotic activity that is going on inside the tubular fruit, which I hardly dare to mention, like in so many other parts of the painting, are telling individual conversation pieces. They invite the viewer, very much like the Nuremberg Games tapestry, to carefully unravel the body parts, reverse engineer the activity that is insinuated, and see the mind-numbing effect that the consumption and consummation of the love fruit has on these naked courtiers. This interpretive act itself makes us viewers participants in these conversations. Are pondering, for example, what it is that the black man over here in this part are pondering what it is about what it is that the black man is whispering into the ear of a white woman, makes us automatically an accomplice of an act that to us may seem rather innocent, whispering, chatting, but that from the point of view of courtly rules of conduct was not acceptable, because gossiping in public about someone else's amorous behavior was entirely against the codes of courtly convention and courtly conversation. This is not the only example of how the painting draws us into the pictorial narrative and makes us part of the activities depicted there, if only in our imagination. The activity that is suggested is going on inside the tubular fruit that I mentioned indicatedly last time, or the activity that is going on in other vessels and turrets cannot be spoken about by me publicly to you without breaking this very code. Even you and I, silently using our imagination in trying to figure out what the nature of the activity that is suggested here in these strange turrets makes the viewer know and see more than he or she should. We already looked at the invitational gesture of the man right in the foreground who offers us a berry of the same love fruit that they are engaged in and enjoying, offers us as viewers to participate, to eat. The painting thus actively leads us to transgress the boundaries between the pictorial world and our own. Something Henry III, the intended viewer of the painting, will have understood and appreciated as he emerges himself from the background of this portrait. He's portrayed against the frame. He's moving to us, moving forward. And to generate among ourselves and with the painting a conversation about the activities that are portrayed and seen against the conventions of courtly love. To summarize, there is no way that we, viewers of the Garden of Earthly Lights, can look at the painting without getting involved, implicated, and entangled in its imagery. We are no different from the men who are ensnared in the prickles of the fruit of love, the helpless human chicks that beg a bird to feed them, or the carol of wild riders parading around the pool of naked women. We are no different. We, also descendants of Adam, who live in a post-lapsarian world, all dream the dream that Bosch has depicted in the central panel. This is our dream, not Bosch's dream, this is our dream. We find it hard, therefore, in our conversations with and about the painting to distinguish between true and phantasmagorical imagery, and to acknowledge that our state of mind is no different from that of the slumbering rock face in the Garden of Eden on the left, and no different from the people that seem to have lost their minds swirling around in the painting, until we may wake up in the face of hell on the right panel. If there is a unifying theme that runs through the triptych, it is the attachment of our eyes to the object or subject of our love, in response to and also in negation of the gaze of Christ and the promise of salvific love union it entails. It is appropriate then that in my final comment I should also ask attention for the gaze of the tree man, the strange figure, the towering figure in the right panel, who has surrendered his mind and body to the vermin of devilish prostitutes, another form of love. Looking backwards and returning in a way Adam's prophetic gaze, he offers a magnifying glass on all the aspects of self-love that the descendants of Adam explore in the center of the triptych. The protagonists of the left panel and those of the right panel, including Lucifer, who has his own way of uniting with human beings, thus place Adam's descendants in the painting, but also us viewers standing in front of the painting in the cross line of their gazes. This makes us realize, paradoxically but quintessentially, that the hell scene on the right panel is not the end of story, as often has been stated. The function of the painting, like so many other works of Bosch, is to generate and sustain in an ongoing fashion the conversation about human nature in its relationship to God and evil. This was in Bosch's time, both from a religious theological perspective, but also in accordance with the conventions of courtly behavior, an open-ended but not directionless conversation. The appeal of the triptych was for the educated viewer at the Burgundian court, the educated viewer we all aspire to be, to develop an eye of judgment and insight into the world around us, into the inner world of our minds, into who we are in the face of God and that of his dark contender. Thank you.